Guys in class, I had no idea who I had lunch with. And all I remember on the way out, I extended an invitation to Mr. England to come to Aggieland whenever he has time. That's the way he said it. He said whenever he has time, TCU asked him to lecture on ethics. So I went home, and by midnight, I get an email from Gordan. Had no idea who Gordan is, as if one of my buddies sent me an email. So I did the smartest thing on this planet. I Googled Gordan England. And obviously my jaw dropped when I found out he was our Secretary of Navy twice, former CEO of General Dynamics, electrical engineer, and also Deputy Secretary of Defense under Dr. Gates. Knowing that during lunch and after lunch at the NAE conference that we attended, the way he presented and introduced himself was absolutely what I call servant leadership in action. A true leader, someone who has served the country and served, especially for us being engineers, the technology industry for years and years. So I was absolutely honored, but I did my best, and it was not easy to respond to his email and not say, yes, Mr. Secretary. I said, hey, he's my buddy, Gordan. So I did that until he came 2 years ago. Even though his wife was not feeling well, a couple of times we had to postpone it, but he drove all the way down to College Station to be with students. So it was extremely important for the Secretary to be with the future leaders of the country and share some of his best practices, what he went through with the next generation of leaders. So it's my absolute pleasure today to introduce and to welcome Secretary England back to Aggieland. And with that in mind, I'm going to sit down. The floor is all his. And if you guys have any question, again, please don't hesitate to ask. Again, let's give him, a welcome. Aggie, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. So actually, I do let people call me secretary. But if they call me secretary, they have to put the words has been in front of it. So they can call me the has been secretary, but they can't call me secretary, right? So, once you're a secretary, it's over. And at that time, people did, but history. And so I don't go by secretary anymore unless you put has been. A couple of my friends put HB in front of it, right, when they send me a note or something. So look, it is nice to be here. Actually, it's delightful to be here. And Dr. Zavi, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Now, when the professor's given a class, the professor expects that you will remember everything. I mean, that's the expectation. If you're a professor, students are going to absorb every single thing you say. If you're a guest like me, your expectation is, hopefully you will remember one thing. And I always feel really good if everybody can remember one thing. So I'm going to give you the one thing to remember, okay? One thing, 4 words, okay? And I'm going to write them down so you don't forget them. Can I write on this?
I think so.
Now let's try this. Nope, that ain't gonna work.
Maybe the black one.
Okay, let me try this one.
That one. This is better.
That one works, okay. Got it, thank you. Okay, so never. Got the 3 words? What do you think the last word is?
Mother.
Ah. So, I am impressed that there is an Aggie code of honor. So this is my code of honor. So when I was a very young boy, I have an older sister and an older brother. My brother died many years ago. But when we were small, we had no rules. My mother literally I grew up in the middle of a city, right? Streets and stuff and lots of people and things. And nobody kept track of you. You pretty much went off, did whatever you were going to do that day. So we had no rules. We could do anything we wanted, but, that was the big but. We could do anything we wanted, but we could never embarrass our mother. That was her only rule, never embarrass her. So that's been my code of honor since I was about 8 or 9 years old, when that was the rule in the house. And so if you're going to be a leader, I will tell you, you have to be an ethical leader. You have to be ethical. You cannot be a leader and not be ethical. So actually, my mom was pretty smart, because, you know, you can't write rules down about being ethical, because no matter how many rules you write down, there's always something that's not in the rules, right? And you can't assume if it's not in the rules, it's okay to do. So it turns out, I mean, again, she was pretty smart. She knew that everybody knew what was right and wrong. I mean, you know when you're going to do something right and wrong. And we knew if we were going to do something to embarrass her. So it was perfect. And I'll tell you, it's been my code of honor, just like your Aggie code of honor, my whole life. I mean, whenever there's a situation arises, I say to myself, would that embarrass my mom? Now, it's not so much that I would know if it would embarrass her or not, but it does cause me to stop and think about the situation in more depth than if I would just sort of make a hasty decision. So if there's anything you take out of this meeting today, I'd like you to remember, don't embarrass your mother. And when you get in a situation where you're not sure of how to proceed, then ask yourself that question, because it will cause you to stop and think. So I was in the Pentagon one day, and students come in periodically, and these were high school students, junior high school students, exceptional students, right? They came to Washington, go around to different departments, see how the government works. They came in the Secretary of Defense office, and I talked to them. I don't know why. I was a designee for whatever reason. Anyway, I spoke to them about DOD, and I always say something about ethics to everybody, because it's so important in business, government, and personal life. So afterwards, questions, and this young man raised his hand, junior in high school. And he said to me, he said, Mr. Secretary, he said, how do you handle an ethical dilemma? Now, this is, you know, like a 1-hour deal, and this is not, you know, a dissertation, so you give a short answer, right? Because they don't want a long answer. So how do you handle an ethical dilemma? So my answer was, it's easy. You don't have ethical dilemmas, because if you're having a dilemma, you already know what the answer is. So if it's not white, if it's gray, dilemma, right? White is right, black is wrong, and gray is in the middle. If it's gray, then you don't get there. You stay white, so you stay out of ethical dilemmas. If you're in a dilemma, you already know what the answer is. So, okay, I'm telling you, you cannot be a leader unless you're ethical. And you have to be ethical all the time, not just at work. I mean, you can't decide, gee, I think I'll be ethical at work, but I'm not going to be ethical in my personal life or dealing with other people or other organizations I'm in. So you have to make that the touchstone of your life. Otherwise, my view is you're not going to be successful. So thinking about this session today, I thought this is about leadership, engineering leadership. But I will tell you, it's really not about engineering. It is about leadership, but that means it's really all about people, right? I mean, it's all about people. Now, I'll talk a little bit, I was vice president. I did come up through the engineering section, as you know, electrical engineer. At lunch, I mentioned I grew up in Baltimore. Neither of my parents went to high school because back then you went to work. And so in my neighborhood, all the row houses in Baltimore, everybody worked. A lot of people still do. I think that was a huge advantage, by the way. It was an enormous advantage for me early on in life to work very young with a lot of people. So one of the jobs I had, I worked at the Colored Association ballpark. So back when I was young, they still had a black baseball league. And so Joe Black and Junior Gilliam and Roy Campanella and all the famous ball players in the Hall of Fame, they all played for the Baltimore Light Giants. And I grew up in Baltimore, and I would work at the ballpark. And so I worked with, by the way, you can't do it now, but I looked up Roy Ashe, you know, who was the famous tennis player. He has a book on athletes, black athletes. I looked up to see when Roy Campanella was catcher because I didn't know how old I was. Well, it turned out, I mean, you can't do it now, but I was 9 years old working at a ballpark, right? And so met a lot of people who worked hard. And I think that's really important, to really appreciate people who work hard in life. I mean, and so turns out I've had lots of important positions, but almost all of my best friends are not people I knew from important positions, they're people who actually work hard every day because that's what they have to do. So I decided, sort of wrote down, what are some characteristics of people at least I knew? And then I'm going to talk about some specific cases. I have a couple of handouts I want to give you. So what are some of the characteristics of people I knew? And Bob Gates, who was president here, I knew well, served with him. I was his deputy, so we had offices together, and Donald Rumsfeld, lots of people in the Pentagon. But people tend to associate me with government. But actually, I was in industry for 40 years, so I'm really more industry than government. Government just happened to be the capstone of my career in industry. So what are some of the characteristics, at least of people that I know? First of all, leaders are doers. Leaders get things done. I mean, personally, they do things. And by the way, you're not always going to be a leader. The fact is, you're always going to be a follower, right? I don't care what position you're in, you're always a follower as well as a leader. And so leaders have generally high energy and they get things done. When the boss says, I have to get something done, he looks to see who does he give it to, right? And he gives it to somebody he has confidence in that they will get it done no matter what it is that needs to be done. Now, it was interesting. When I was Secretary of the Navy, Rumsfeld would always give me all these strange jobs. And everybody in the Pentagon would say, why is the Secretary of the Navy doing that? That's not his job. Well, Rumsfeld would give it to me because he knew it would get done. So doers, high energy, and no excuses. You find a way to get the job done. So I think all leaders, not only do their organizations excel, but they personally excel on the job. So when you're asked to do something, I mean, it's do it. You got to get it done or you're not going to, I mean, you're always in a follower mode. Then you're a follower and a leader, and that stays with you forever. You're a follower and a leader. Being a follower, I think, is what makes you a leader. And by the way, people emulate their leaders. So we have a couple Marines in here. Who are Marines? Marines? A couple Marines, okay. I said this before. I think the Marines are the finest organization in the world. They're the finest organization in the world because the whole premise of the Marine Corps is excellence. Every single thing they do is based on they're going to be the best in the world. They are going to be better than anybody else. No matter what they do, they are going to be the best in the world. So it's built on excellence. So people look up to leadership. People want to be proud of the organization they're in, just like you're proud to be at A&M, because it's a great institution, great professors, great research, right? It's a great institution. People are proud of the core, right? Proud of all the people who have been successful. Everybody wants to be in a terrific organization. And when you look up, I mean, that's what you do. You look up and you've got to take pride in the leadership. So the leader sets the example. And so you got to be a doer, you got to be ethical, you got to set the standards, because other people will act like you. People will act like you. They will take on your characteristics and they will act like you, so therefore you have to do it right every time. Leaders have broad knowledge. If you're going to be an engineering leader, you better be good at other than just engineering. I mean, they may do engineering, but people are people, right? Homo sapiens, and they all have emotions, and they all have issues, and they all have everything else that goes on in their lives. So you have to have broad knowledge. You have to know something about history. You have to know something about the world. You have to know something about sociology. I mean, you can't just stay focused in your comfort zone. You have to get outside your comfort zone and learn every single thing you can so you have broad-based knowledge. And by the way, this old adage is, as you get higher up in the organization, you get broader, but you're not as deep. I don't think that's true. Let me tell you, as you go up in the organization, you do get broader because you get into finance and human resources and everything else. But you better be deep. You better not be shallow. I mean, as you get higher up in your organization, you work harder. You don't work less. My experience is you have to know a lot more about a lot more subjects the higher you go in the organization. So things get harder. I remember one day my secretary at General Dynamics, I was president of General Dynamics building airplanes, and I don't know, it was late at night, and we'd been working proposals and whatever, and she said to me, she said, you know, she said, everybody in this building would like to have your job. She said, but there's not a handful of people who would work that hard to have this job. And I think that's right. I mean, it's a decision you have to make, right? The higher you get, the harder you work. You don't do less, you do more, and more is expected of you. People in leadership positions know what needs to be done. So one time my son, junior in high school, he said to me, Dad, he said, what do engineers do? Because I was a practicing engineer, and he was considering what he was going to do when he went to college. And I said, well, he wanted to, and he said, give me a short answer, Dad, right? So I said, engineers solve problems. That really wasn't a correct answer. It was partially correct. What engineers really do is they create solutions, right? But okay, that's, nonetheless, I said they solve problems. So he said, well, then I assume that the engineer who solves problems better, they become the boss. And I said, no, they don't become the boss. I said, they sort of become the middle manager of the thing. He said, and who becomes the boss? I said, the boss is the person who knows what problem to solve. So when you go into a senior position, there's no job description. Nobody says, here's the 20 things you need to go do. I mean, I came in as Secretary of the Navy. They said, welcome, you're Secretary of the Navy. And there you were, Secretary of the Navy. When I was president of General Dynamics, I had more of an idea because I worked my way through the organization for many, many years. But nonetheless, nobody says, here's what you have to do. So you have to decide. I mean, where do people spend their energy? Where do you spend your money? Where do you put your research? Right? How do you operate this whole organization? What is the priority? So leaders figure out what to do. And by the way, I would contend to figure out what to do requires broad knowledge. You can't decide to do this with a very narrow focus, very narrow field. The other thing I would encourage you to do is stay in good physical condition. You know, leaders take care of their people. Marine Corps again, right? Leaders take care of their people. You can't take care of your people if you don't take care of yourself. And the people who work for you expect that you will take care of yourself. If you can't, then you're not going to be able to take care of them. It's that simple. And by the way, you can't work long hours. You can't go be studying stuff and be under stress all the time. You can't do this day after day if you're in a really tough job, if you're not in good physical condition. So keep yourself, and by the way, you can't be mentally good condition if you're not in physically good condition, right? They go together. So you have to maintain yourself in good physical condition if you're going to be a leader. You can't just take it easy. Find time to go to the gym at night or whatever you have to do. You have to be a good communicator. You have to be able to communicate at least adequately. You don't have to be superb. You don't have to be somebody who can be on TV all the time, but you do have to be able to communicate. By the way, I would contend that the shortcomings of most engineers is they're not good communicators. So I'm going to jump ahead to one of my principles. So I'm in an airplane, company airplane, with a fellow named Dick Adams. Dick Adams, at that time, was president of General Dynamics, and I was like engineering manager or something. I'm in an airplane with Dick Adams. So Dick Adams is a Georgia Tech graduate, master's in aeronautical engineer, member of the National Academy of Engineering, so pretty smart guy, right? I'm in an airplane with Dick Adams. He's reading something, and he says to me, he said, "Gordon, how does a bistatic radar work?" So I said, now mind you, we're in the military aircraft business. I said, Mr. Adams, bistatic radar, one radar transmits, another radar receives a signal. I said, very important from military airplane point of view, because enemy detects a signal, they can actually know where the airplane is, but if another airplane is receiving this signal, they don't know because they're receiving it passively. So I said, one transmitter transmits, another receives. So he said, okay, I got it. So about 2 weeks later, I'm in a meeting with Dick Adams. Meeting of 15 people, and someone is giving a presentation on some technology. Obviously a very capable engineer, given a briefing on technology. In the middle of the briefing, Dick Adams raps on the table and he said, listen, he said, I don't understand this at all. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, here's my view. He said, the way I see it, if I don't understand it, it's not that I don't understand it. He said, my view is if you can't explain it in a way that somebody else can understand it, then you don't understand it. That if you really understand a subject, then you can explain it simply. I've never forgotten that. And by the way, Dick Adams was my boss, and I eventually got promoted, and I've always thought maybe that was an important conversation in that airplane. So being able to communicate complex issues simply, and also just being able to communicate, right, to employees, to people, to press, whatever, is hugely important. I think leaders have to be adaptable to different personalities. Everybody has a different personality. And of course, you know, you've got all the classes on the 4 personality types and all that, and within them there's probably thousands of personalities. I would say that most people expect that people will adapt to them. Leaders, I believe, adapt to people. Leaders change so they can work effectively with people of different kinds of personalities, etc. And so I think if you're a leader, you have to be sensitive of the people that you're dealing with so you can interact with them effectively. Otherwise, if you're like this, you're not going to be able to communicate effectively, and you're not going to be able to deal with each other effectively. Last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to go into some specific examples. You have to keep learning. And so I I told everybody a little bit ago my grandmother. So let me give you a perspective on this. Because I frankly think you have a much tougher road than I had during my career. So everybody know what the Pony Express was, right? Who doesn't know? Pony Express, right? You know what year the Pony Express was? Does anybody know? So in 1860, the Pony Express took the news of Abraham Lincoln's victory, election victory, and carried the news west. And it took 7 days and 17 hours for the Pony Express to take the news west, so the people out west knew that Abraham Lincoln won the election. Okay, now here's what's significant about that. So my grandmother was alive when the Pony Express took the news out west. 3 generations of my family. Now, my grandmother was young, and I'm getting older in my generation, but nonetheless, 3 generations, grandmother, mother, me, and those 3 generations of my family, we have gone from, right, bows and arrows and horses, that every single thing that exists on the face of the earth today in my 3 generations. So humankind has been around, what, 300,000 years or something, depending, I guess people believe different things, but I think that's about it, a couple thousand generations of people. So in the last 3 generations, almost all the knowledge of humankind has been accumulated and, with engineers, right, developed into all the technology, all the products, everything that exists in the world today. So here's mankind, and then in this tiny little slice, here's all the knowledge of mankind has happened in this very short period of time. And it's going faster. So I was with some high school students the other day, and you're just not that much older. So I said, here's what's most remarkable about that. I said, I expect that all the changes that happened in the 3 generations of my family, all that change that's happened in that deal, all of that will happen in your 1 generation. So if you think that sort of what you see out there is how you're going to live your life, it isn't. I can assure you there are going to be dramatic things happen during your career in life that you can't even think about today, because that's the nature of what the accumulation of knowledge is and the application of that knowledge. So think about it. For the first time ever, we actually name generations, right? So every generation is so different from the generation before them that we give them names. And they're different because of the technology they're exposed to, right? For a long time, everybody did whatever dad did, son did, whatever mom did, daughters did, right? And now, generations are totally different. So I think as you go forward, you're going to have this enormous challenge. First of all, I mean, the technology is going to be just blowing through you, blowing through society, and it's going to be having changes on society. And every generation is going to be different, or even maybe sub-generations, and not just in the United States, but big deltas around the world. So I think there are going to be bigger social issues to deal with, bigger problems for leaders, harder to deal with because of this huge divergence. So that tells me you have to keep learning. By the way, I think the whole process of go to elementary school, go to high school, go to college, get a job is over. I mean, it sort of worked for me, right? I got out of school, went to work, sure, learned a lot along the way, kept learning a lot along the way. But I think for you, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to, and the whole nation is going to have to find a way that every 10 years or something, just like a professor gets a sabbatical, everybody's going to have a sabbatical. By the way, already there are a lot of legal cases of people in their mid-40s for job discrimination. in their mid-40s. And you know what? It's really not job discrimination. It's knowledge discrimination. See, people already, by the way, in Silicon Valley, I was just with the dean. In Silicon Valley, it's not unusual for new hires to make more money than the people who were hired a couple years before. And by the way, I talked to one of my friends in Silicon Valley, has a big company. The oldest person in the whole company is 30 years old. So the knowledge is starting to make a big, I think you're going to have a big challenge when you're in a leadership position, particularly if you're in a technical organization. The engineers have a lot of spin-off. Engineers can do lots and lots of jobs. By the way, don't do a job you're not qualified for, right? I mean, don't decide to run a hospital if you're not a surgeon. You don't, I mean, right? Stick to what you know about. And by the way, not unusual engineers go into other areas, you know, get an MBA. I got an MBA. But people ask my advice on that, and I don't do it right away, right? Wait until you really need it, where it's going to make a difference in your career. But I would keep taking classes in every single thing you can, not just technical, but everything. Okay, now I have a handout. I actually have 3 handouts for you. And I also have something for you, too, which I'll give you. Okay, so these are, quote, Secretary of the Navy Principles of Leadership. And they already are not. So I'll tell you how they came about. So after I had given some talks as Secretary of the Navy a few times, my public affairs officer was a Navy captain, Captain Wednesday, and he would write notes down. And so after I would say things a few times, he wrote them down. And then one day he compiled this because I spoke at the Naval Academy. They have a Forrestal lecture series. So he put these together. I'll let you pass them out because I'm going to talk about some of these, okay? Here, guys. I think I have enough. I mean, pass them around. Yeah. Pass them up and around. And I'm sure there's enough. You may just have, if you have extras, pass them back, would you please? So if you look at the bottom of it, England expects that every man will do his duty. Now, so that is from the Battle of Trafalgar. And I think it's probably, so Lord Nelson, Navy captain, Battle of Trafalgar may be the most famous naval battle ever. It's when the British defeated the Spanish and the French, and eventually led to Napoleon's defeat. So when they were getting ready to go into battle, mind you, these are all ships of the line, right? These are wooden ships and sailing ships and cannonballs, and right, that's how people fought back then. So Nelson sends out orders to the fleet. And I think it's probably the best leadership statement ever. I mean, and I love Churchill and everything, but here's about to go into combat. I mean, literally, I mean, think about it now. You're in the high seas, cannonballs. I mean, you're not coming back unless, right, your ship can prevail in this. I mean, you're not coming back, right? So he doesn't tell people to align the guns. He doesn't tell them to check their ammo, right? He doesn't do anything about tell the captains to rally your men. He says, England, right? They're all fighting for country England. He said, England expects that every man will do his duty. That's it. I mean, like, country expects you to do your duty. And by the way, the Battle of Trafalgar, I don't think the British lost any ships, and they decimated the French and the Spanish. But it's a great leadership statement. Well, and of course, since my name's England, it sort of fell in, right? I mean, England expects, you know, I'm Secretary of the Navy, and so it's a natural, right? England expects every man to do his duty. I actually brought from the Trafalgar Museum. I don't know how I'm going to do this yet. We'll figure it out. Will everybody take a number or something? So that's the signal flags. That's the signal flags. And if you read the signal flags, because these were flags they put up, right? That's how you send a message, signal flags, ship to ship, right? So that's the flag. If you read between it, it says, England expects every man will do his duty, right? So that's from the Trafalgar Museum. So I signed and put Secretary of the Navy 72 and 73. So we're going to give this flag to somebody probably randomly today. In 50 years, you can probably put it on eBay if you're still on eBay, and it may be worth something, right? But I also have something else for everybody too. Okay, so look at number 11 for me, and that's ethical standards more important than legal requirements. So I'm going to tell you my first ethical situation, because I was exactly your age. So at University of Maryland, and by the way, it's interesting, right? I remember this well. So when I was at University of Maryland, working my way through Maryland, one of the jobs I had was proctor in the dorm. I don't know if they have such a thing anymore, but we had dormitories, and so I was an upperclassman, and I had been working before I went to school, so I was a little bit older. And so do they have proctors, anything like that in dorms now?
They do RAs.
They do? What are they called?
RAs.
RAs, okay, resident assistant. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think I was resident assistant, and I had a all freshmen area. I had all the freshmen in my dormitory. The whole dormitory was all freshmen. So one day, the fellow who was head of all the resident assistants got word to me, however, to come see him. So I went to see the head of the residence fellow I worked for, right? So he said to me, he said, Gordon, he said, I'm thinking of hiring, I need another resident assistant. He said, there's a fellow I'm planning to hire, and he's in the School of Engineering, so he said, I'm pretty sure you know him. And I did know him. So the resident assistant said to me, do you recommend him to be a resident assistant? And I said, no. And he said, well, why not? I said, I don't recommend him, I know him. I said, I don't recommend him because he cheats in every class I'm in. Cheats on labs, cheats on exams, turns in other people's homework. I said, and I can't recommend somebody, particularly somebody who's going to be with freshmen, I cannot recommend that they be a resident assistant. So about 2 weeks later, the fellow who did not get the job comes up to me and he says, hey, Gordon, I heard you screwed me out of that job for resident assistant. So that's sort of an early lesson in me, because, see, it was hugely unethical of my boss, right, who obviously took the easy way out and said, fellow's first name was John, by the way, obviously said to John, I'd like to give you that job, but, right, Gordan England said, you know, you're not the guy for this, or whatever, you know, et cetera, right? Look, bosses take responsibilities for their actions, right? You don't lay it off on somebody else, particularly somebody who works for you, right? Early lesson in life, right? I mean, bosses are responsible for decisions. You don't lay off hard decisions on somebody else. They're your decisions. Lesson has stuck with me forever, right? Because it early in life made a big impression on me. So ethical, that was unethical behavior in my view for the guy I worked for. So we sold General Dynamics to Lockheed. This was like 1992, I think it was. I'm president of General Dynamics Fort Worth. We've sold the company, $1.5 billion. We sold to Lockheed. I'm sitting in a car in New York, driver driving the car, CEO of Lockheed's in the backseat of the car with me, and he says to me, he says, Gordon, he says, now that we own the company, he said, tell me how you handle commission agents when you're selling airplanes. So when we sell airplanes, and we don't sell an airplane, right? We sell airplanes, right, with support and everything. $3 billion, $5 billion, $7 billion. Back then, right now, $10, $15 billion sales. So big, big money, right? So a commission agent, right, on a lot of commission agents exist for lots of goods and services, where they get a percentage, get a sale, because they did a good job, they get a couple percent of the sale, and that's how they make their living, and that's the way the world works. So he says to me, how do you handle commission agents? I said, Dan, we don't handle commission agents because for international sales, we don't use commission agents. So he said, why not? And I said, well, because it's a lot of money. And we don't know where the money goes when it's overseas. We can't track the money, but the money's so big, it can easily corrupt even governments, because there's enough money. Even 3% of those big numbers is a big. I said, so we don't use a commission agent. So he said, well, what do you do if a company requires, a country requires a commission agent? And they do. I mean, some countries say you have to use a commission agent. So Dan says, well, what do you do if the country requires you to have a commission agent? And I said, easy. We lose. We don't pay commission agents. We lose. About 6 months later, we lost a contract. And this country not only wanted us to use a commission agent, they told us who to use, right? I mean, we got this guy in our pocket, right? This is who you're going to use. Well, look, we still bid because you never really know, but sure enough, we lost. And CEO called me up and said, you know, what the hell is going on? We lost the contract. We just spent all this money. I reminded him of the conversation in the back seat. It's illegal to have a commission agent. It's unethical in my view, and in our view, of it, sort of our company view, to do that. And so we didn't do it. So here's a case where ethics trumps legal, because it is the right thing to do. And by the way, I was always convinced that our reputation in the marketplace as being completely honest would overwhelm, that we would always get more business than we would lose. And I believe that's the case. I think that's how it worked. We did better. Chad Holliday was my predecessor. He was chair of the National Academy of Engineering. And he worked for DuPont. And they had to work in China, and somebody would go from Hong Kong into China like 3 times a week. And at that time, to go from Hong Kong into China, you had to get a pass. You had to physically get a pass and show it to get through. And they had a building you could go in and get your pass. But what happened is people who would go through there regularly, they had all learned that you didn't really have to get a pass. It's all you had to do was pay $50 to the person at the border deal, and they let you through all the time, and that's all you had to do, and you could do it every year, every week, go through. Well, DuPont decided it's only $50, but it's a bribe, basically, right? Giving somebody $50 so you don't have to go up to the deals. So they said, we're not doing that. So every week, 3 times a week, the guy from DuPont would go into this building, do whatever he had to do, fill out the forms, go in. Did that every week. Everybody else drove through. He went in, did his stuff. About a year later, a reporter sort of heard about this thing, about how this one guy was going in 3 times a week and nobody else was. And she wrote it up about how DuPont would not pay $50, instead going to that building every day to get a pass. Well, the story got circulated all around DuPont. So it was a powerful message. It was a powerful, powerful message to the ethics of the company that they wouldn't spend $50. I mean, think about it. It's like going to dinner one night, right? They wouldn't spend $50 so somebody could readily just go through Hong Kong into China, right? Very, very strong message. And by the way, a terrific message. It's the kind of message you really want to spend. So look at number 1, provide an environment. I think, after ethics, what do leaders do? They provide an environment for everybody to excel. Because that's ultimately, organizations only do well if everybody in the organization excels. So you want to provide an environment for everybody to excel. So when I was at Fort Worth, I was director of avionics. So I was the electronics guy for the airplane. So they came to me one day and they said, boy, we got a great opportunity for you, Gordan. You can leave Texas and you can go to Michigan and be vice president of engineering in Michigan. Now, I will tell you, if you live in Texas, you do not want to go to Michigan. So I had this great opportunity to go to Michigan, be vice president of engineering at a company that they had bought from Chrysler Corporation called Land Systems. So Land Systems did things like M1 battle tanks, right? 90-ton battle tanks, right? So here I am, an avionics guy going out to be vice president of engineering for what is a gigantic mechanical engineering enterprise, right? Huge plants and welding and all that kind of stuff, right? My job, though, was not to do that. My job was to rebuild the whole business and make it a whole totally systems engineering rather than just a ground combat thing. But here's the interesting part about it. The plant was inside a Chrysler facility. And the person who ran the facility wasn't at the facility. They were in downtown Detroit in the big tower building where all the executives. So the executives were downtown. The facility was out north of Detroit. So the person who ran it, the general manager, we wasn't even there. And in the engineering organization, there was a large area of all the engineers. And then the directors of engineering, they all had small offices. And they're all next to each other, like lined up down here with a secretary in front. So if any engineer wanted to talk to one of the directors of engineering, you had to walk through that door to get into this room, and then you had to go into another door to get into the director's office. So to a large extent, it was like putting a do not disturb sign outside, right? Because, I mean, that's pretty tough to go walk through a couple doors to see the person you work for, right? So, I mean, not only was it emotionally and all the other things you talk about when you're a leader, but, I mean, physically, I mean, it was a separation of me and all of you, right? I mean, here we are, and the rest of you are on the other side of that door, right? So we moved into a new facility, and interesting enough, the facility had a whole section. By now I'm vice president of engineering, had a section for all the vice presidents. Vice president marketing, finance, had a big corner office for me, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, when you walked into that area, the carpet changed. So as you're going down the hallway, carpet changed, the walls changed, paintings changed. You're now going into, quote, executive area, right? With all the physical indications that I'm now moving into another area, right? So I decided it can't be that way. right? I mean, it just can't be. So my instincts were, you can't run it this way. So we had a big engineering section, and so what I did in the middle of the engineering area, I built literally a glass office, 4-sided glass office. I had shades, so if I had a private meeting, I could pull the shades down. Otherwise, I was in the middle, glass, everybody could see me every day. I could walk in and out, they could walk in and out. It's amazing how it changed the construct of the department. I mean, it's amazing. If people could physically see you, be with you, shirt sleeves rolled up, working with you, right? And so, I mean, something as simple as the physical layout sends strong messages when you're in a leadership position. And by the way, that's in addition to all the dignity and respect and all the things that leaders are supposed to do, right, in terms of their leadership of organizations. One of the handouts I have for you is from Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. Jim Mattis, 4-star Marine, right? He was a 1-star Marine when I was Secretary of the Navy. Secretary of the Navy, you know, secretary. By the way, secretary's level, by Constitution, U.S. military works for civilian leadership. Civilian leadership is a service secretary, Secretary of the Army, Navy, Air Force. And Navy has both Navy and Marines, and so that's civilian leadership of the military. So now Jim Mattis is Secretary of Defense, right? He was 4-star Marine Secretary. So I brought his copy of leadership principles with you just so you could look at a 4-star Marine's view of what's important in leadership position. And I copied down one of them. You'll see it when it's handed out. And it says, attitudes are caught, not taught. Attitudes are caught, not taught, right? So again, people pay attention to leaders, and so you have to really pay attention what you do, how you do it, how you describe, because people will use you as the model. Okay, so if you look at number 2 in that, and by the way, check my time. How are we doing time-wise here, I guess? Oh. So treat every person with dignity and respect. Nobody is more important than anybody else. Okay, so remember this. Jobs are more important. People are not more important. Jobs are more important. The people are not more important. So everybody you treat with dignity and respect. I mean, everybody. And every single job is important. Every job. I mean, you can't do anything without every single person showing up. You know, every time I go to a hotel, I think, you know, I'm only here because somebody cleans this place, right? Otherwise, there's no place for me to spend the night. I mean, every single job is hugely important. Yeah, some we attach more importance to. But I'll tell you, the people who do all those jobs, God bless them, people who do all these jobs, or you couldn't do any of your job. And I was always very appreciative. Thank you, Ben. Thank you. I'll tell you, I was always very appreciative. People worked in my organization. You know, people can work anywhere. They don't have to work for you. I mean, work any place, right? I mean, I was always thankful people showed up and worked in my organization, right? I was thankful that they were there because they didn't have to be there. They could be doing something else with their life. So one day a fellow walks in my office and he says, Mr. England, he said, I just want to tell you I'm really afraid of my job. He said, I come to work every day, he said, just frightened. He said, what's going to happen to me? I said, what are you talking about? He said, no, but I'm now president of General Dynamics in Fort Worth about a week. And this is all 20, 30 years ago, so I don't mind talking about it because it's all different now. He said, I've been here about a week as president. He said, well, I've gotten, I'll call them demerits, right? You know what demerit is, do something wrong and get a write-up, right? He said, I've gotten 2 write-ups. He said, if I get one more, I get fired. I said, explain it to me. He said, well, he said, I came to work here about 10 years ago. He said, I was here about a week. He said, I was young, kind of a hellraiser, did something I shouldn't have done. He said, my boss wrote me up. And he said, if you get written up once, you get a reprimand. It goes in your record. He said, then about a year later, I got in trouble again. I got written up. He said, if you get written up twice, you get a week off without pay. He said, so I got a week off without pay. He said, but that really sobered me up. He said, not long after that, I got married. I got a couple of kids. He said, I work hard. He said, but, he said, I've got these 2 write-ups. He said, if I get one more, I'm automatically out of a job. So I call up HR. And I know the answer to my question, but I said to the HR guys, I said, look, I said, I understand this demerit business. I said, I assume that since we're writing people up who do bad things, that we're also writing people up who do good things. I said, so I'd like to know what's the ratio in your file of the people who do good things versus the people who do bad things. Well, I knew what the answer was before I asked the question, right? I mean, there's nobody written up doing good things because, by and large, the supervisors on the floor were getting rated on, how well they sort of kept discipline and order, right? And that was by how many people they wrote up. So, I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever, right? So we kept the system, except we set everybody to 0. And then I told all the supervisors, okay, I said, here's what you do. The incentive is for people to do good things, not to catch them doing bad things. If you're really a good supervisor, nobody does a bad thing, and everybody does 10 good things, right? So we changed the evaluation system of everybody on the factory floor, right? And by the way, when people did good things, we gave them dinners and all sorts of stuff, right? And it changed the whole character of how we treated people, right? The whole floor changed in terms of how they treated people. And they started treating everybody in a whole different way than they had before. What are we going to do? We're going to end at 2?
We got 10 minutes, yes.
We got 10 minutes. Okay, I told you this, remember this. I'll give you one story, then we'll have some discussion time left. Right after I became Secretary of the Navy, I had to go testify. House Armed Services Committee, it's about 50, 60 members of the House. And there was a very controversial issue called Vieques. Vieques is an island off of Puerto Rico. And it was the Navy used it for a bombing range. And there was a big issue, should the Navy use this for a bombing range or should we turn it over to the island of Vieques? Or should we turn the island over to Puerto Rico that they could develop it? Anyway, this sounds trivial, but it was before 9/11 and it was a huge big issue and I'd been secretary for about a month. I was confirmed in May, and then, of course, 9/11 changed everything. But to this point, this was a big issue, right? It paled in comparison to everything later. But so I go to this hearing, and Bob Stump, since deceased, is chairman of the committee. He told me ahead of time, he said, listen, I have to have a hearing on this. I'll limit everybody to 5 minutes. He said, but I want to tell you, he said, our members are really mad about this. And the TV cameras were on. It's even worse at a political hearing, right? And for about 50 minutes, 5 minutes at a time, they just beat the hell out of the Secretary of the Navy, right? It happened to be me sitting down there in the witness chair. So after it was over, Bob Stump said, hey, Gordon, come up to my office. So I went up to his office, and he said to me, he said, I want to tell you something. He said, you got beat up badly today. He said, but you know what? He said, it doesn't matter. He said, in this town, nobody has to like you, but they do have to respect you. He said, and you've earned the respect of the committee. So the reason I say this is because I find it fascinating that they have all these polls about how well everybody's liked in Washington. It's not about being liked, it's about being respected. And the way you are respected, and there's actually, when people would give me sort of remembrances, they would put this down. So the way you are respected is you are forthright, honest, and direct with everybody in every circumstance. So you're forthright, and so if I can leave you with another message like, right, don't embarrass your mother. So the way you want to conduct yourself, I mean, if you want to be respected, it's nice to be liked, but if you're the boss, you have to be respected more than liked. You have to be forthright, honest, and direct with everybody in every circumstance. And people will respect you for the fact of your honesty. And now, by the way, don't carry this to extreme. I don't tell my wife the dress makes her look fat. I mean, you do have to limit this to meaningful situations, right? But you do, I think, as a leader, you do have to be forthright, honest, and direct, and you have to do it in every circumstance, even when it's hard to do, so people do have confidence in what you say every time. And by the way, that was sort of my golden rule in Washington for 8 years. And people would sometimes get mad at me and they would rant and rave, but you know what? At the end of the day, people need to respect you if you're in a leadership position. Okay, now I have something for everybody before time runs out here, while you're all still here. So I have something I want you to take with you. And the reason I want you to do it is, the reason I brought this is, you can also sell this on eBay. When the first one came out, I was Secretary of the Navy first time. In the military, they give out coins, challenge. This is a coin for the Secretary of the Navy, which I actually designed myself, okay? You give them to people for doing a really good job. So it's a thank you, right, for doing a really good job. Give them to people in the military, whatever. So I have one for each of you. And yeah, you can sell it. By the way, when the first one came out, you never see them on eBay, but there was one. My son called me up, said he saw it. And the bidding was up to $90 on what they sold it for, and that was years ago. So this is one that's actually says 72nd and 73rd Secretary of the Navy, so there's only been 2 people in the history of the country twice, and there aren't many of these around. But I'd rather you not sell it. The reason I'm going to give it to you is, what I'd like you to do is keep it and put it in your desk drawer wherever you are when you're out on a job, and whenever you have a dilemma, a difficult situation comes up, you can either say to yourself, I don't want to embarrass your mother, or how would the secretary handle this? Not that you want to know how I would handle it, but so that you will pause and think about how you should handle any given situation, right? So it's to help you think your way through and not just make a quick decision, but say, hey, what's the right way to do this, right? And so anyway, I'd like you to keep it. But, by the way, Willie Nelson, one time sold a song, I think, to Patti Page, and he sold it for $25. And Patti Page made it #1 hit, and, she made a couple million bucks. And they said to Willie Nelson, why did you sell that to her for $25? And Willie Nelson said, if you're hungry, $25 is a lot of money, right? So it's okay if you sell it if you have to, but otherwise. So here you go, guys. You can pull those apart. Won't you? There's enough here if you all just. There you go. You can pass them all down there. How we got? Here, if there's extra ones, just pass them back, okay? Yeah, pass them up there, Ben. Okay, now I got this one other deal I'm going to give out, right? This one, you only keep this one. So this is my Trafalgar tie, right? How are we going to do this? How many in this room? How many people in this room? We give everybody a number and pick a number, right? How are we going to do this? Ben? He must. We'll give him. He's got the job, right? I'm losing my voice. You got yours?
Oh, I got mine.
Everybody have one? How are you going to give his tie out, Ben? Well, you can figure that out maybe some other time. Take a drawing or something.
As much as I like to keep the tie, I prefer, to give this one, to someone who has served the country in a different capacity.
Well, that'd be good.
Just getting education. So, if Evan, you don't mind, I'd like to have you.
That'd be good. Good. That'd be perfect.
Secretary.
There you go.
Some of you guys know, Evan was with the Marine past 6 years, 7 years almost. So I let you.
There you go.
Give it to
Evan,
him.
Semper Fi. God bless. Thank you, sir. It's good man, Evan. Thank you. Good. So we have a few minutes. We have a few minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Comments, questions? Anybody?
So let's go ahead and get started. I just want to add one thing. If anybody decides to sell this, if I see your name anywhere on eBay, by the power of professorial thing that the state of Texas has given me, I will flunk you. Number one. Number two, if you need $100, please bring me the coin. Give me the coin. I'll give you $100 as a loaner. And when you have money, I sell you the coin back. So
right.
I think this is an honor, and I want to thank you, and we will all remember that. I was also thinking to put 2 questions on the exam. What were the 2 things, Secretary said he would do? Number 1, never embarrass your mother. You guys may want to add, never embarrass your mother, comma, professor. And the second one that he said is be direct, forthright,
honest,
and honest at every occasion you have. Except, with your girlfriend, your daughters, and your wife. In my case, my wife and daughters. If I want to be direct, and I have been, it doesn't pay off well. Okay, the plan was to ask any question that you like. Please make it personal. We had a list of questions we discussed in the class, but frankly, it's up to you. This is your session. Whether it has to do with leadership, technology trends, anything related to Department of Defense or international policy. The course is about leadership, personal leadership, but I don't want you guys to be bounded, with leadership-related questions. So if you raise your hand, I'm going to come to you, pass you the mic. Please ask question, and then I will let Mr. England answer your questions. Okay? Shall we start with, I know every one of you guys, and I can call you by your name if you don't raise your hand. And then we have our esteemed professor in the back of the room. They wanted to know if they can ask questions. The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. They bring over 100 years of experience right there. And also same as our young PhD student over there, Michelle. Okay, so who wants to start? Go ahead. Thank you for taking the leadership role in asking questions.
How did you handle making tough decisions?
How do I handle tough decisions?
Yes.
So, so I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that two ways. So I worked for Donald Rumsfeld, and I worked for Bob Gates, right? So Donald Rumsfeld was very data oriented. That is, when you went in to see Donald Rumsfeld had a meeting, he wanted every bit of information you could get. So he was very analytical. He wanted charts, graphs, data, assumptions, and it was impossible to give him enough, right? So he made decisions based on huge amounts of information. And they were generally by, presentations, right? Big ones, right? Lots of data go on for quite a while. When Bob Gates came in, he said to me, he said, Gordon, I don't want any of those presentations. He said, that's not how I make decisions. He said, you come tell me what the situation is, what the parameters are, what your recommendation is, and then we'll decide. So here were two extremes of decision making, and by two very capable guys, right? I mean, Rumsfeld had been Secretary of Defense his second time. He'd been Congressman 4 times, Chief of Staff of the White House for Ford. Hugely knowledgeable, right? He was data-based. Here was Bob Gates, who has served under 6 presidents, had been president of Texas A&M University, dealing with all the politics and all in Texas, and he didn't deal at all that way, right? So they both worked. Both extremes worked. And I would say, for myself, it was some of each, right? Sometimes it was database, and sometimes it was, I will tell you one thing about decision making in Washington. There's no right or wrong. There's better and worse, but there's no right or wrong, right? The issues are so complex in so many dimensions, and so many things you don't know, that you make the best decisions you can. But I don't think there's a right and wrong answer. There's just better answers, right? So I think this, and I think that's different than industry, although, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but I think you're getting into a whole new round of, quote, ethical issues, technical issues. Look at Zuckerman, right, with Facebook right now, right? This whole privacy issue. By the way, you realize in China can do facial recognition on 1.3 billion people. So the example in China is that, literally, this is real. Gal pulls up to the light, and she's got a red light. She's on a bicycle. Her picture shows up on the screen at the red light. She's on the bike. Her picture shows up on the screen, and it says on the screen, "Don't go across the light. You did 2 weeks ago, or you'll be fined." Right? I mean, that's really facial recognition, right? Real time, right? So I mean, we're not going to get into that. I don't think we will, just because of our privacy issues, but I think you're going to run into a lot of those kind of issues more and more as time goes on. So, but look, I think the decision making varies, depends on the issue itself.
And as a follow-up to the first question, for you personally, did it get easier to make tough decisions further on in your career?
Yes. I would say it got much easier to make major decisions as I went on in my career. By the way, first of all, I went to a public university just like everybody here. I had no concept of ever going into government, no concept of doing anything except working as an engineer my whole life. I mean, I never envisioned I'd have any job I ever had my whole life. They just happened. I didn't plan anything, right? People ask me, what was it like to be with the President of the United States? And I said, every time I sat in the Oval Office of the President of the United States, I thought to myself, what the hell am I doing here, right? I mean, like, wow, how did I get here, right? But yes, you know, I do think it's really important. The military has a process that, like in my office, secretary, they have military assistants and all, and they would physically sit in meetings with me, even though they didn't participate. They sat in meetings just to understand how discussions took place, how decisions were made, you know, what the dynamics were in meetings like that, right? So that they would literally get experience at, you know, what's the environment? How do you deal in those environments? So as you go through them, you obviously get confidence, right? As you sit through those kind of meetings, you get more experience and confidence that you know how to deal in those meetings. How do you take issue with the Secretary of State or whatever, right? Or the Vice President, or if you don't agree? You know, you don't just say, hey, that's crazy, or, you know, right? I mean, there's actually sort of protocols that develop that take place in those kind of interactions that you learn from. So I would say yes, you definitely learn as you get more experience in the decision process.
Okay? Randy? The mic is actually for the recording purposes, so please be a little louder when you're asking questions. It's not for you guys. Go ahead.
Sorry. I wanted to ask, is there one thing on a daily basis or on a weekly basis that you do to keep yourself wanting more, to keep yourself learning? Like you said, you think we should learn every day. Do you think we should continue to learn no matter how old you get? Is there something that you do, like I said, on a daily or weekly basis to keep reminding yourself that you want to learn, you want to keep going?
So I probably read a couple hours every day. I read something, a couple hours every day. By the way, I go through every news source I can quickly every day. By the way, I find Apple News to be really good because they just condense from time. You know, they get it for everywhere, and I can go through quickly. But I go through every news source I can, so I keep abreast. I get stuff sent to me from Washington, you know, and stuff. I get stuff from Naval Institute. I get stuff from national academies. I mean, so I get a huge amount of information comes in. By the way, one thing you will find that's hugely beneficial, once you move up one step in the organization, you start getting inputs. And the higher you go, the more inputs you get, right? So somebody can work years on a project and they brief you in 30 minutes and you get the full benefit out of 2 years of work that somebody else did, right? So at some point, you're absorbing an enormous amount of information, right? So I say, you know, I just read everything I can. I read all sorts of abstracts. I don't watch TV. I mean, I just don't have time to, I'm not interested in that. But I do really go through all sorts of news. By the way, I will tell you this, they talk about fake news. I think there's fake news, but there's a lot of incorrect news. So in my entire time in Washington, if I had been in a meeting and then it was reported in the papers and I read about it in the papers or whatever, reporting mechanism, it was never right, but it was never wrong. So why I said that is, invariably a report would have a data point that was correct. But whoever wrote the article would then take that data point and draw a straight line in whatever direction they wanted the line to go, right? So the article was correct, that the data point was right, but the line was always wrong. So the articles were never right. And that always bothered me, and I think that was true every time. The articles were never right because whoever wrote the article put their own spin on it.
Okay. Yes.
So having no military background and stepping into the position as Secretary of the Navy.
Pardon?
Having no military background and stepping into the position as Secretary of the Navy, do you think that affected your leadership in the beginning in any way, as far as like not wanting to step on anybody's toes, I guess? Or like, did you approach it differently than you did other leadership roles?
So here's how it works, which is rather interesting. So secretary level is civilian leadership of the military. So the Secretary of the Air Force that was confirmed the first time with me had a Navy background. The Secretary of the Army had an Army background. Neither one lasted as secretary. And so while I was there, we actually went through quite a few secretaries. So here's the issue if you're the secretary. If you are a secretary of a service, civilian leadership, you represent the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, right? You implement the policies of the President. So I was very, very close to the military, Vern Clarkson, and we're all good friends. All the people I served with, we still know each other, like each other, et cetera, right? We're good friends. But you have to be careful you don't become an advocate for your service. That's not your job. Your job is not to advocate. Your job is to lead the service in the direction of the President, Secretary of Defense, whatever the national military objective is set out by them. So it's very easy. You have to be very careful. Typically what happens, if people have a military background and they're in those jobs, they tend to get sucked into the military more than their civilian leadership role, which is just the opposite of being in the military, right? I mean, that's why it's civilian leadership. So I think it's an advantage not to have a military background in a service position. By the way, Jim Mattis, General Mattis, he had to get an exemption because he had not been out of the military however many years when he became Secretary of Defense. And by the way, I think Secretary Mattis is superb as Secretary of Defense. I mean, he's probably one of the better secretaries we've ever had.
Okay, Scott?
Just go down the line.
Sure, that would be a great idea.
Okay. What are the most lacking traits among leaders today?
The most lacking?
Traits among leaders today.
Wow. Well, I think at the senior level, you can say communicating, right? I mean, definitely. I mean, I don't think the president's a very good communicator, right? Which in a way is too bad because that's really, I think, the role of the president is communicate so people understand, follow, right, et cetera. Doesn't mean you don't disagree with his policies, but I think he would be vastly more effective if he was a better communicator. But I think at least from a political point of view, I mean, my view is people who serve, they give up a lot to serve. You know, when you decide to go into government, if you go into DOD, you're not allowed to have any investments. I mean, you give up a lot, right? So I think people who serve, they're doing it all for the right reasons. Whether people agree with them or not, they do it for all the right reasons. So frankly, I admire people who serve. I do think there's a mistake in some technical organizations where they have people who aren't qualified to run technical. So Microsoft, who was the guy before Nadella, who ran Microsoft, the marketing? Forgot his name now. Anyway, you know, the day he left, the stock went up 5% that day, right? Because you can't run an organization if you don't understand what the product of the organization is. I mean, I think that's just impossible. That's why I say you're not going to run, I don't think an engineering technology person is going to run a hospital, right, dealing with brain surgery and all that because you just don't have the background to do it. So I think the fault I see is I look at companies, I'm not sure they have the right people in a leadership position.
Let me go to the other side of the room. Mr. Ramirez?
In regards to your career as an engineer,
Pardon?
Was there any growing pains going from working as an electrical engineer to eventually becoming the CEO of a huge, defense corporation?
Well, of course, it took time to do that, right? I mean, it wasn't like it just happened overnight. So I progressively, had more senior positions. So I sort of grew with the job. I mean, each time I had another job, and it was bigger, and so you grew into those jobs. I do need to emphasize for you that I think in each of those jobs, this is not about getting more technical excellence. I mean, as you move up, you have to be technically knowledgeable. You don't have to be an expert, but you do have to know a much broader range of knowledge, right? So I said I got my MBA. I got my MBA. I'd been working 14 years when I went to get my MBA, when I finally got my MBA. I got my MBA at night, right? But I was working as a project engineer when I went to get my MBA, and I actually I had to know more about finance and project management and law, and I needed all that stuff, right? So when I decided to get my MBA, it actually wasn't so much getting my MBA, I just felt like I didn't know enough to do the job I was in, and I had to go learn all this stuff, right? So that's how I ended up getting my MBA. I just had to know more. So I think you should get more responsibility. You have to know more and more and more. And like I said, I don't think you can know it that deep. I think you got to know it, right? By the way, I think one of the most valuable classes I ever had was in law, being able to deal with lawyers and knowing when to push back, and particularly in government, because everything's legal in government, right? The whole structure of government is all a legal framework. Knowing when to push back and when not to push back is hugely important. So, just a few law courses, and then what you pick up just because of the situations you're in. But learn more than just engineering. You've got to know more than just engineering. That is not enough to run a technical organization, unless maybe it's a research organization or something like that, right? But if it's a big company, you better know law, and you better know finance, and human resources and everything else.
Okay. Okay.
Nobody's perfect, so
This is a ringer here.
either you yourself or one of your subordinates did something wrong. Let's say you did do something to embarrass your mother, or someone did something to embarrass you as a boss. Or how did you handle that to bring them back into, I want to say connection, looking for like consequence versus compassion?
So, first of all, I want to tell you, I don't think you ever want to be in a position that the first time you deal with somebody, it's an issue. And that's true with customers. I hate to keep going back to government, but I'll come back to specifically. But so in government, I went out and met all the people on the Hill. I went and introduced myself, said, I'm Sanchez, want to come by. They typically say, what can I do for you? I said, nothing. Just came by, wanted to say hello, make your acquaintance, etc., right? Because I want a relationship before I actually ask them for something, right? And I think that's true with your subordinates. Hopefully, if you have an issue with one of your subordinates because somebody did something, just because they made a bad decision, by the way, right? It may have made a decision that cost you a lot of money or didn't work out, whatever, right? You have to have enough of a relationship to deal other than just that immediate problem. You can deal with the problem because you know the person well enough to do it, right? You know their strength, their weakness, how they got there. And so, I think you can have a conversation that's much more positive if you know the person well. And therefore, this whole human relations part of it, this whole emotional intelligence, all this, now they have practical courses. They didn't have them when I had it. You just sort of either figured it out yourself or it was instinctive or whatever. But But I think you need to have a relationship with your subordinates, particularly people who report directly to you. And by the way, they have to feel comfortable to tell you when you screwed up, right? So sounds a little direct, but I had a guy in Fort Worth, and he was, quote, unquote, he was my bullshit man. He could walk in any time at all, open up the door, kick over the trash can, and say, boss, we just made that decision. That is complete bullshit, right? That was his job. He was a very senior guy, knew everybody, knew what was going on, had insights I didn't have, and that was one of his jobs. Don't let me do something that's just stupid, right? And so that's what his job was, to come in and tell me I did something that was just stupid so I could fix it, right, before it did real damage, right? So I think you have to have a relationship that people can come in and say, boss, you got this all wrong. And you got to be able to tell people the same thing. You're doing this wrong. And by the way, you got to be able to let people go too. So to give you an idea, when I came into president of General Dynamics Fort Worth, we had 26,500 people. The wall had come down in 1989, right? Peace dividend of the 90s all came out of the Department of Defense budget. So the budget of DOD went way down. We were building like 20 airplanes a month. We went to, I don't know, 6 a year or something, right? By the time I left, we went from 26,500 people to 11,500. In 4 years, I mean, I literally terminated 15,000 people out of that plant. Let me tell you how we did it, though. We knew it took 2 years to build an airplane. I mean, literally, aluminum came in one end and stuff, right? And it came through the factory, built it, right? And at the other end, the airplane threw away 2 years later, 3 years later. And we had unions. And so different parts of the union had different seniority rights. So we knew what the production was going to be 2 years in advance because of orders that were placed, right? We knew 2 years in advance. So when the budgets went down, I went to HR and I said, hey, we're going to have to shrink this place, and I'm going to tell everybody what day they're going to be laid off. And HR said to me, boss, that's crazy. You tell everybody they're going to be laid off in 2 years, nobody's going to work. I said, it's just the opposite. I'm going to treat them, right? Dignity and respect. I said, we're going to treat them like adults. We're going to tell them what's going to happen. So we told every single person in the plant, we said, on this day of this month or that year is your last day, and you need a plan for it. So what happened? You know what happened? The efficiency went up in the plant, the quality went up in the plant. People knew exactly what was going to happen. They knew it wasn't my fault, budgets went down, right? I mean, I'm doing what I got to do to maintain, to save the plant for the next generation. So people would come in my office, not going to come in, say, boss, I just want to say goodbye. This is my last day. You told me 2 years ago this is my last day. But I want to tell you it's going to be okay. I said, 2 years ago you told me that. My wife and I were going to buy a new car. Instead of buying a new car, my wife went to nursing school. And she's going to graduate next month, and we're okay. Shake hands and leave, right? And I still know those folks. I mean, I still see them in Fort Worth. They still come up and stuff, right? I mean, so I think you have to deal with all this, right? And by the way, forthright, honest, and direct, right? I mean, that was I was doing it back then before government. I mean, I think you do have to be forthright with people. And laid off 15,000 people. That's a lot of people to lay off in one plant, right? But you know what? They ended up a very efficient producer, and they won the F-35. And, it's all still successful and still going, right? If we hadn't done it right, probably would have gone out of business.
Question?
what would you say was one of your greatest failures as a leader, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I guess you don't think about your failures. Gosh, I don't know.
Was there any?
Pardon?
Was there any failure?
Well, look,
I mean, it all
you don't
depends how you
always-
look at it.
You don't always know they're failures, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots of failures along the way. I don't know. I would guess. I mean, I don't think it was program-wise, but probably people-wise. I mean, again, there were so many people and so many circumstances. I'm sure some of those probably weren't handled correctly that could have been, but I'll probably purge them from my database, right, just because. But you got to think it's personnel, right, of all the times we. And by the way, I mean, even in government, right, like, the Secretary of the Air Force, right, was let go. I mean, I was the guy who went and told him because I was the guy who helped get him in that position to the Senate. So there were a lot of uncomfortable things I had to go do, but there weren't things that weren't right to do. They were just uncomfortable to do. But I would guess probably personnel. I mean, I dealt with so many people. While you try to do that right, nonetheless, I mean, you can't be perfect at that.
Come on.
How did you balance the desires and objectives set forth by your superiors to the desire to ethically
Wait,
lead?
my what now?
The objectives and the things your superiors want you to get done, and your desire to lead the people beneath you ethically and not treat them wrong while you're trying to get them to complete that objective.
So the professor and I had that conversation for about 30 seconds here before, because look, you do actually end up in tough situations, right? Where the business is demanding you do something and, it doesn't square with you. So look, I would say you can't always win out the way you want, but I think you can generally moderate things to an acceptable level, frankly. I mean, again, you have to have a relationship, and people have to have a relationship with you that they respect your input, right? So, I mean, I didn't hesitate to push back, right, to corporate office or CEOs. I mean, frankly, I was a very successful business guy for the company. I mean, we were very successful. We made money. We grew the business. So, I mean, they didn't just tell me stuff I had to do, right? If I wasn't comfortable with something, I might tell them I wasn't comfortable with it. And maybe I didn't get away with it completely, but at least it caused them and me to go ponder it and get the best answer we could.
Randy?
I just kind of wanted to add to kind of his question earlier when when you talked about when you get older how you need to learn like so many more subjects besides engineering. And I wanted to ask you, so instead of getting a master's in something to do with engineering, as far as our undergraduate, we are all in engineering, and would you recommend that we go ahead and get a master's in project management or in something in the business side to help us excel later on in life, or would you recommend that we wait on that later?
So first of all, I mean, you have to decide what your career in life is going to be, right? I mean, you have to decide that. By the way, you may decide you want to be an engineer. Just be an engineer, right? Lots and lots of engineers are engineers, and the last thing they want to do is get involved with all the people issues and all the management issues and the finance. They don't want anything to do with any of that stuff. I understand that completely, right? And they are totally, completely happy and satisfied doing that. Maybe more so than other people, I don't know. So, I mean, I think you got to figure this out on your own, right? And by the way, I think you tend to get into jobs that hopefully utilize your strengths, right? I mean, you tend to be attracted to something that you're comfortable with, right? And so then you got to decide. And by the way, your personal life tends to interfere with this, right? People get married, they have families, they got parents that get ill. I mean, there's a whole life that goes on, and this isn't life. This is just a piece of it, right? So, I mean, you make decisions for all kinds of reasons. At the end of the day, hopefully you make decisions that make you happy and your family happy. And it may not be exactly what you want to do, but in the total context, you're all happy, right? So I think you got to figure that out on your own, right? I always lived close to the plant. You know, I always lived close to the plant because if I had to work late at night, I would come home and have dinner with my wife and kids. And then I go back to work if I had to. But as far as my kids were home, I was home, right? I mean, I spent, so I always wanted to be 20 minutes from the plant because I wanted to be able to come home when I needed to, right? It worked, you know, so, but now, of course, that doesn't work for everybody. It's hard, right? Depending on where you live, it's tough to travel and all that stuff. So, look, I think everybody has to make their own life decisions. However, let me remind you, this is not a dress rehearsal. You do not get to do this again. You only get to do this once. So make decisions that life is happy and fulfilling, and don't get caught up in, I want to be the boss of something. That isn't what it's about. Right? I mean, this is not a dress rehearsal. You don't get to do this a second time, right? One time. So make sure it's something that you're comfortable and happy with. Right?
Ron?
Real quick question. So business environments are changing dramatically. We're becoming more and more global. So in your opinion, what's the #1 factor that's impacting, you know, successful leadership of global teams or companies that are spread globally?
So I think you're absolutely right. It is all global. It's no longer national, right? Every large corporation is global. I made a comment, you know, here we were, all these guys in Fort Worth, Texas, and none of us had ever gone anywhere. And all of a sudden we get an F-16 contract, and ultimately we're building airplanes in 19 countries of the world, and we're dealing with all these people around the world and languages, and like it was, wow, right? It all happened quickly, right? And everybody had to adapt. And that was in the early 80s, and now we're 30 years so later. But I would say everything's international. I don't recommend people learn languages. I think we're going to have simultaneous translation sooner than we imagine. But I do think part of this learning process is knowing more about cultures that you're going to deal with and all that. The cultures, I think, is everything, right? I mean, it's not technology, it's all cultures and how to deal with people. I think that's hugely important in this day and age. And by the way, I mean, my own, you know, we did a lot of stuff Middle East because we had to, right? How we were in war and everything else in the Middle East, and did a lot of stuff in Asia. And well, I'll tell you, the world is a radically different place depending on where you go, right? With all different beliefs. And no, I think that's hugely important. So I think if I was a young student now, I'd be thinking globally every day.
Thank you.
Steve?
Thank you. One of the predominant management theories of a few years ago used to involve mentoring.
I'm sorry.
Mentoring not long ago, it was a extremely popular management theory. Would you talk about mentoring in your career? Were you mentored? Did you mentor? Is it valuable? Was it important on your climb to the top?
Was it successful?
So I would say.
Was it successful? Yeah, thank you. Excuse me.
I would say I was never formally mentored, but I worked for some spectacularly wonderful people who basically did mentor me, right? I mean, early on. my very first job out of college, Gemini space program, the person I worked for was just a terrific person. He gave me a lot of authority, responsibility, guidance, advice, counsel, right? So on day one, I mean, I had a lot of help. When I went to General Dynamics, you know, my boss at General Dynamics, same way. I mean, I always had terrific people I worked for. I mean, I guess I was just blessed that everybody I worked for, and I would say they were all extraordinarily helpful. General Dynamics in Fort Worth were extraordinary engineers and managers, and I mean, that whole generation's gone now, literally, but they were all just highly dedicated and smart, and knew what to do, and you know, I learned a lot from people I worked for. I like to think that people who worked for me were the same way, because I spent a lot of time with people. When I got transferred, I brought people with me. And a lot of them came with me. Some of them came out of industry in the Navy with me, and so I was never in a formal mentoring program, but I was always fortunate that, man, I just worked for terrific people that I admired and respected. And by the way, a lot of them, not just in my chain of command, but in the whole management structure. And by the way, I'm sure I took on a lot of their mannerisms, right? I mean, you know, you copy the people you respect, right? That's what you do. I mean, that's why it's hugely important if you're in a senior position to know that other people are going to copy your way. But no, I think mentoring, hugely valuable. Formal or informal. Again, I was lucky. I just got great people.
Michelle?
You talked about adaptability being...
About what?
Adaptability to different situations being a key. And what are just some of the things you look for when you walk into a situation that you're unfamiliar with?
Wait, I'm having trouble hearing you in the background.
I can talk louder.
That's all right.
Adaptability. You talked as a key to success, right? To walk in a situation. What are some of the things that you look for when you walk into an unfamiliar situation or one you're not expecting to quickly assess what you're going to have to adapt to or who you're going to have to show up as the leader in that room?
So I'm not sure I have an answer, but I can tell you this: the first time you walk in the Oval Office, there's a high level of adaptability that goes on right away, right? I would say typically, you don't end up in a situation where you are to focus immediately, right? I mean, my experience is you have some time to get the lay of the land before you are front and center. So. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you walk into a surrounding like that, you do have to assess it pretty quickly, because, I mean, if you handle it wrong the first time, you may never get the opportunity to handle it again, right? So I do think you have to assess it and adapt to it. And so I think you need your antenna out. But I would hope that people that are in those levels know enough to adapt before they speak up or whatever, right? Like I say, military does a great job of this, right? They put people in these environments just to observe, so they sort of know what the methodology is before they're actually thrust into it themselves. Which I guess is really mentoring, right, Professor? I mean, that's, I think, like it. Yeah, I think the military probably does a super job of that.
Dr. Yang?
Hey, I have a quick question. You emphasized a couple of times being a great leader needs to identify the problem to solve in the organization.
Wait, I need to step up. I'm sorry, say again. It's not you, it's my hearing.
It's okay. You emphasized a couple of times that being a great leader needs to identify problems to solve in the organization. I think that all the engineers are trained to solve the problem. So how to kind of transition from a problem solver to a problem identifier? How to develop that critical skill?
So I think it is a critical, it really is a critical skill, and I'm not sure there's I guess I'd have to say this is experience, right? I mean, I'm not sure you can learn this. I think this is experience, really. But I would say it is the defining characteristics of the really good leaders I've known. And I think for some reason I actually am pretty good at this myself, frankly. That is knowing what to focus on. And here, by the way, I think this is where broad understanding and knowledge is incredibly important to you, that you can assimilate a broad range of information and out of that determine what's important and what's the way forward. And I think if I have any single gift, it's that. I'm not a technical specialist, but somehow in my career, for whatever it is, people can give me 50 different kind of inputs, and I can say, look, this is the issue we need to deal with. And I believe that's, if there's any single thing that has been important to my success, it's the ability to do that single thing. And I don't know exactly how you get to that, but whatever it is, I think people once in a while have said to me, they said, how'd you know we should go work on that? And I said, I don't know. It just seemed like that was the right approach, right? So I don't think you can do that, though, if you have a narrow focus. I mean, one message, I guess, I give her, you have to be broad-based knowledge, because everything in this world today is interconnected in every way. I mean, it isn't technology by itself, right? Technology is connected to everything. And so, like if you're a program manager on a program, I mean, you're responsible for everything on a program. You're responsible for what the press thinks about it, what the policy, right? Not just you manage the universe of this thing. And if you're going to manage the universe, you better understand something about the universe. Broad-based knowledge, I think, is hugely important. Learn something about everything. By the way, when I was in college, I worked my way through college. I decided, well, if I'm going to work my way through college, it'll take me longer. So I planned on a 5-year career, but then I found out what I did is I worked, but I still took extra classes. So I took English literature. Don't ask me why. I mean, I took English literature one semester. Well, it turned out at that time it was all co-eds in class. I was the only, and I was an engineer, and all co-eds, because they all had to take English literature. They didn't take engineering and all that stuff back then, right? So I thought, this could be terrific, get to meet all these co-eds, right? Well, then they all got mad at me because I got an A in the class, and for them it was important, and for me it was just sort of, take a class. But actually, I think it was a value to me, right? I mean, it seems strange, but I think a lot of things you can learn that aren't directly associated with engineering help in your technical decision process.
Any other questions? Yeah. And well?
How did you go from industry to government, and why?
So that's a very good question. So when I was in industry, so again, it's where your interests lie, right? So when I was in industry, I was in different organizations. I actually wrote articles when I was, an avionics guy, published stuff because I was interested. So I got published a few times. I was president of a couple technical organizations, local and stuff. Ended up on the Defense Science Board, which is advising the Department of Defense in technical matters. Then on the board, I chaired a few studies for them. And, so I got to know people in Washington over time. They got to know me. when the Bush administration and all that was going on, I had been approached earlier about possibly coming into government, but it wasn't the right time. But I decided that at some point I would go into government later in my career, sort of end of my career. And so I was asked to be interviewed by the Bush administration. And I knew a lot of the people then. I knew people in Congress because I had testified, and I'd been on studies. I knew pretty much how DOD worked, built military equipment, so I knew the military pretty well, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, I was offered a job secretary of the Navy, and I thought it was going to be for 2 years. I called up my wife. I said, what do you think? Do this for 2 years? She said, fine. Well, it turned out to be 8 years, but, you know, that was before 9/11. So, but it seemed like the right thing to do. And to some extent, it was the capstone of my career to go into government, because all that time I'd been a contractor down here, and all of a sudden I was, you know, senior government. So anyway, it seemed like the right thing to do, and in retrospect, I'm just glad I did it, obviously.
Okay, to wrap up the day, the only question that I have is, would you recommend a life-changing book to this generation so they will be better leaders than our generation or the previous generations?
I don't think I have a life-changing book. I mean, there's been books I've read that I thought were just terrific in terms of, and the book I think that I still, one of my all-time favorite was The Coldest Winter. It's about Korea. I'll tell you, I am, for the people in the military and the people who are in the Corps and going into the military, for all of you to think about this. I mean, it's absolutely amazing when you think about it. But there are people who voluntarily serve in the military and are wounded or give up their lives for people they don't know. I mean, pretty profound when you think about the history of the country, of all the people who have given their lives for people they don't even know, right, for future. I mean, that's pretty profound when you decide you're going to give your life. I mean, that's big time stuff. So I really like books, just like Trafalgar. I mean, I like books about military and people who serve, and, you know, because without them, we wouldn't be here. We literally would not be here, right? So I really like people, I like books about people who literally have changed the country. And by the way, it goes all the way back George Washington and, right, all the people in the Civil War. I mean, just, but Korean War is always sort of, I don't know why I was interested in The Coldest Winter, which was sort of the rationale, the politics, what was going on in Russia, China. It sort of gave you a perspective that unfortunately you don't have ahead of time, but you can get after the fact, right? I mean, it's tough ahead of time to get that perspective. But anyway, there's lots of good books out there.
As a token of appreciation, on behalf of students, we have a present for you and Mrs. England.
Good.
So she will forgive us, you know, for having you. But again, thank you very much for coming. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you guys.